Please note this episode contains discussions of situations or themes that some may find emotionally distressing. Listener discretion is advised.
They would shoot people at will. We were very vulnerable. I still remember you could hear those steps outside coming up and into the flat. They took away everybody except me. My family was still intact, but not for long. I became a slave laborer at the age of 12. It was like a hell. There were people there. They were like skeletons. Some of them would just collapse and die. Piles of bodies. They just couldn't cope. You didn't feel human anymore.
Today's guest is the incredible Mala Tribich, a Holocaust survivor and educator who was liberated by the British Army from Bergen Belsen Concentration Camp in April of 1945. Now, the Holocaust saw the murder of over 6 million Jews across Europe. That's around 2/3 of Europe's entire Jewish population, and Mala's here today to share her story. Now, Mala was born in Poland in 1930, but when the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, her family was forced to flee eastwards. Her journey through the ghettos and concentration camps, they really highlight the horrors of the Holocaust. Many of Mala's family were killed, and between the ages of 8 to 14, Mala witnessed the sheer brutality of the Nazi regime. And Mala joins me today to share her story, and to discuss the dangers of unchecked antisemitism, race hatred and dehumanisation, and her story of surviving the Holocaust. And I hope her life lessons will help each and every one of us. Well, Mala, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us today. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. Yes, the weather's better, it's cooler.
Oh, well, it's so lovely to have you here today. And, Mala, today there's so much to talk about in your life, but I actually want to start off way back right at the beginning of your life. And I'm going to ask you a question, which is, what's the earliest memory that you have in your childhood? Do you have any, the first memories that come to mind?
I can't say that I remember the very early years, like some people do from the age of 2 or 3 or 1. But I remember that just a few sort of memories of that part. And then I started school a year early.
Oh, wow. Why was that?
Because my mother took me when she went to enroll my brother.
Okay.
And my brother was put into the second year. We called it in Poland second class, but it wouldn't make sense here. So he was put into the second year because he could already read and write, and he was very bright. And then the headmaster, who was actually, interviewing us, said, "What about your daughter?" And my mother said, "I'll bring her back next year." And because I wasn't due to start yet, we used to start at 7, and I was only 6. So he said, well, we could put her into the first year, and she could just be an observer. And then next year she can start properly from the beginning. But in Poland, we started at 7, and we had to pass into the next year. It wasn't an automatic going to the next year. So I took the exam and I passed. I don't think I did all that well, but I passed. So I went on to the second year, went on to second year.
Yes.
And I didn't have very many years because war started. So I only had I can't actually remember now. I thought I had 3 years of schooling. First, second, yes, I was 9. I started at 6. Yeah, I had 3 years of school, and that's all I had.
And which is really interesting, I think, later when we talk, because you had this almost extra year in school that many other people your age didn't have. Because I know later you were almost forced to mature quicker than anybody else at the age of 8. And going then through, so you're at school with your brother in the same year, mum's at home. And then in 1939, of course, things changed when the Nazis invaded Poland. And I know your family then had to flee eastwards. But Mala, what was that day like when you began to flee? Or what happened that day? You went home from school, or what happened?
No, actually, we were on holiday with our grandparents in another town called Sherrads. And my mother came to collect us so we could start school the next day. And the war started because we were on a coach going home, and there was bombing, and they started. It wasn't heavy bombing, but I know that the bus stopped several times, and we had to get off, and it was a difficult journey, but we reached our town safely. You know.
And then you reach your town, so you're coming from a holiday, you know that bombing is happening. And what happens then when you get home that day from the holiday?
Well, then we already were, I remember taking shelter in a sort of semi-basement at the front of the building. There was just one shop, and very unusually, there was one shop that you had to go down to a couple of steps.
Yeah.
And it was a semi-basement, and we took shelter there during the bombing. I remember we were sitting there in this sort of corridor, and I remember a man coming through who had been actually wounded, just a shrapnel or something, because as he was walking, he wasn't walking quite very well, and there was blood. He was leaving sort of signs of blood behind. It wasn't a serious injury, but a shrapnel hit him.
And so now in your hometown, things started to change quite a lot when the first ghetto was created. And I think, I know the Nazis went on to build over 1,000 ghettos, but this was the very first one. Is it the Piotrko ghetto?
Yes.
And just for those who are listening who maybe don't know anything about a ghetto or what a ghetto is, could you just share what is a ghetto for people to understand this a little bit more?
Well, it goes back some centuries in history, but as I know it, a ghetto is that where you're actually cut off from the rest of society, and you are in a confined space. And probably ghettos varied over the centuries in different places, but in our case, it was all the Jews were put into behind often barbed wire or solid walls. And not only was the place confined, it was very small, much too small for the number of people that it had to house. And conditions were dreadful. I really only know about my ghetto. And I know that it started within 2 months of the war. So by the war started in September. By the 1st of November, we were already behind ghetto walls. We had to move out of our home. And it was quite overcrowded. It was the worst part of town. It was a very lovely town. I remember it well, and I've been back several times. Wow. And I really, every time, people say to me, don't you mind going back and all the memories? But no, I have the happy memories when I go back, and because the town is a lovely town. And for me, it is a sort of revisiting my happy past.
Yeah.
In this case, but in the ghetto, we were first of all confined to a very limited space. There was overcrowding. People had to find accommodation very quickly and exchange it with other people who lived there, or not necessarily that way. It was all a bit chaotic. Some people did better than other people. We did very well by getting, my parents managed to get one room in a flat, but a very large room and a kitchen. And there was a small hall and a toilet, no bathroom. And beyond our room, there was another room, which was a small room, but that was allocated to other people, which meant that they had to go through our room to go into their room. But I mean, there was no privacy. No. There were none of the normal things that we enjoyed. And, everything was just so limited. Well, I think that perhaps I am underestimating it, because the life in the ghetto was very harsh. And not only from the point of view of the accommodation, which was very small and we were very crowded, but it was patrolled by German soldiers all the time. And they would shoot people just at will, because they fancied shooting someone. One didn't have to do anything even to just get shot for nothing. In fact, I can tell you one example. We lived in a block of flats on the top floor. I think it was the 3rd floor. And in the hall downstairs, there was a man shot. He was killed by a German soldier, and he was left lying there for a week. And he was actually an accountant. He was my father's accountant. And at that time, I was just barely 9, because I was still 8 when the war started. And I had never seen a dead person. And I was terrified of dead people. I mean, we weren't sophisticated children in those days, with knowing about everything. Mm-hmm. And I was terrified to go past the dead body. I mean, I had my own thoughts about it, and I was terribly frightened. Yeah. I don't know how other people were affected, my friends, because we didn't even discuss it.
And nobody, I mean, this poor man, of course, has been shot.
Well, he had been shot dead.
And then his poor body is laying there.
Yeah, we weren't allowed to move it for a week. It wasn't a choice. So that was quite a horrific scene.
And Mala, I know that during this time as well, your parents tried for you, and I believe your cousin, to leave the ghetto.
Yeah.
And you did leave at one point, and passing you as Christians, if I understand, and then you came back. But what was that like when you left and then coming back? Because you're 8 or 9 years old right now.
Well, it was a bit scary. I say a bit because the arrangements were made with a man from another town called Częstochowa, which was about an hour and a half away from Piotrków. And it was actually, Częstochowa was very close to Germany, to the border, and there were a lot of Germans living there. Right. And the man who was supposed to save us, that's my cousin and me, he was originally German, but his status was Volksdeutsche as opposed to Reichsdeutsche.
Okay.
One is the kind, you probably know the difference.
But should we go into the difference if people don't know?
Well, people who were born in Germany and lived in Germany, they were German, obviously. but Germans who lived abroad, and it may have been a special status at that time because of the war. Volksdeutsche is, one is, I know the German word Reichsdeutsche is a proper German in the Reich in Germany. And Volksdeutsche is a German who lives abroad, basically.
Yeah.
I think that explains it best. So he was a Volksdeutscher, and he was doing it for money. He was prepared to hire 2 Jewish girls, and arrangements were made. He actually came over with his sister-in-law into the ghetto he was smuggled in, so they could discuss conditions and price and so on. I wasn't party to that. I don't know what arrangements they made. All I knew is that I was going with my cousin Ija, a year younger, and we were to stay there during the deportations in my town. And when it was safe, in inverted commas, because nothing was ever safe, then we would return to Piotrków.
Okay.
And, you know, on hindsight, I mean, I didn't think about it. That's all I knew. But in fact, when I think about it now, I think, well, how could they be sure that they'll survive the deportations, that they will be safe, that they'll be there for us when we return, and what was going to happen then? But these are my post-war sort of thoughts. But the idea was for us to travel by train, and this man, he put down all his conditions and his price. I don't know how much my parents paid. And my aunt and uncle were there. I wasn't at that meeting when they met to discuss. And the plan was, he said that he will come back in a week's time, and he was paid in advance.
Okay. And
he said he'll come back in a week's time to collect me, and then a week later he'll come back to collect my cousin.
Yeah.
And my aunt actually pleaded with him. She said, we've only got one child, and I was one of 3 children, the middle one. And she said, will you take my daughter first? Because none of us knew the actual date of the deportations. Okay. And he said, no, he'll take me first. I don't know why he did that, for what reason, but that's because he already said it and he wanted his way, probably. So that's how it happened. Wow. My aunt told me afterwards that she actually gave a little diamond ring. It wasn't very valuable, but just a little something to the woman that came with him, his sister-in-law, just to make sure that her daughter will be all right. Just a little extra, perhaps they'll look after her better. And that's how it happened. We went by train, one at a time, a week apart. And traveling itself was very scary because there was actually a reward for handing in Jews. And some people made it into a career, and they were out looking for Jews. I mean, how their perception of Jews, there are plenty of Jews who didn't look what they call Jewish, and there's quite a lot of Christians who did look Jewish. Mm-hmm. But anyway, this was the thinking at that time. Jews have to be done away with.
And at that point, Mala, you're with your cousin. So you go first. A week later, your cousin arrives.
But, you know, sitting on a train, if anyone looked at us for more than a few seconds, we thought, they're suspecting us.
Goodness me.
But nothing. We were both there with blue eyes.
Yeah.
And, well, it all happened. We found ourselves both in Częstochowa, on the outskirts with a middle-aged couple. And they were this man's parents-in-law. He lived round the corner with his wife and child.
And so you're now there with your cousin, and as the days go on, the weeks go on, you started, I can only imagine, 8, 9 years old, missing mum and dad, missing your siblings. What were those days like? What were you doing day to day? You had your cousin with you, but you were missing home.
We're very vulnerable. We're very
Yeah.
scared, and we're very homesick. And we didn't do very much every day. But for instance, when there was a knock on the door and they didn't know who it was, they quickly hid us into anything that's the nearest, like into a cupboard under the bed. So we're always on. We actually were supposed to be relatives who had come to stay from Warsaw. And so we did have an alibi. Sometimes it was okay for us to mix, and sometimes it wasn't. We never knew, what was around the corner and what will happen. Yeah. And we were just scared all the time.
And as those days go on, then I understand your cousin was feeling really homesick.
Yes, she was. She really couldn't bear it. And she asked to be taken home. Okay. She was told that the deportations are still going on. And she said, so she can't go home, but she said that they've got very good friends in Piotrków who are hiding her parents' valuables. Okay. They will take her in. And the man said, okay. He took her back. And I thought how lucky she was. And, I thought she was safe. She was safer than I was. She was with her parents. But then when time came for me to go back, the deportations were over. Arrangements were made to meet my father. Okay. To hand me over to him in a flour mill, which before the war belonged to him in partnership with his brother and another man. Now he was lucky to have a job there. And when we arrived, there was my father waiting, but also my uncle, Joseph Klein. He looked at us and he went white with shock. He said, "Where's my daughter?" And the man said, "I brought her back. I took her to your friends." He did say the name, which I don't repeat. And my uncle said, "But she's not there." These were very good friends, and if they had the daughter, they would know about it. But he said, "She's not there. Where is she? What have you done with my child?" And I still remember vividly my uncle with his hands behind his back, looking at the ground, pacing there and back, saying, "What have you done with my child?" And that's the end of the story.
You never saw cousin ever again.
Nobody knows what happened to Ija. And my aunt, soon after that, my uncle was arrested and my father. And there were actually, my maiden name was Helfgott. There were two Helfgott brothers, my father and his brother. Yeah. And my uncle was my mother's brother, whose name was Klein, and there were two Klein brothers. So there were two Helfgott, two Kleins, and they arrested the four of them. They also arrested a lot of other people who had nothing to do with this. So we never knew why they arrested them, but they were in prison for a little while, and then they took them out, walked them to the Jewish cemetery, and they were all lined up against the wall and shot. But no, what I've left out is that one Helfgott and one Klein was released, and that was my father and one of my uncles. Okay. But Ija's father was shot. So my aunt lost her husband and her daughter, her only child, within a very short space of time. But she survived the war.
And at this point then your father wasn't taken there, so he was released. And do you see him again back in the ghetto?
Yes, because the ghetto was then, it was after the deportations. Okay. They had deported I can't think of the 32,000, I think. But no, our ghetto didn't contain but that number. But anyway, everybody was deported except the people with work permits.
Wow. Okay.
And my brother had a work permit.
Yeah.
My father, mother, and sister were in hiding during the deportations, and there were 3 different families, and I was in Częstochowa.
Right.
But we all survived the deportations because I found my family intact when I got back, which was a miracle because of very, very few families. I don't know how many other families were left.
Yeah.
People, whole families had been annihilated, and they were all deported. Originally, there were 24,000 people in the ghetto. Actually, there were only 15,000 in Piotrków, but there was an influx of a lot more people from around the area.
Yeah.
So there were ultimately it rose to 28,000, so the overcrowding was terrible. But 4,000 died through various epidemics. Mm-hmm. And there were 24,000 left, and of that, 22,000 were deported, 22,000 about that, pretty well that figure, and 2,200 were left in the ghetto because they had jobs, and they had these jobs that were preparing sort of camps, built camps around this area, and that they were safe, in those days.
And then, Mala, life continues then in the ghetto, as you say, by a miracle. You find your family when you come back. But then I go through the years now towards 1943 because you're in the ghetto.
Yes, but what actually the sort of plan they had and which they carried out was that they knew that a lot of people were in hiding during the deportations, and people were desperate to save themselves. So some of them lived in sewers, in the open, in anywhere out of sight. And some people survived, and rather like me and my family. Yeah. And they were aware of this, and they knew that the people were smuggling themselves into the ghetto. Like I, for instance, went through with a column of men, and no one saw me, but they did see me. The fact was that they knew people were coming back. They were the illegals, and they turned a blind eye. They let them filter in. And when they thought everybody was back, then they started rounding them up. And of course, my family was still intact. Yeah. But not for long, because when they thought everyone was back, they started looking for them, searching for them. They were hiding within the ghetto.
And these are German soldiers coming inside the ghetto and looking?
Yes. And there was Jewish police as well. There was the Jewish police there. But that's something that we had to have in a ghetto. Yeah. It was compulsory. Not that they cherished the job, but they had an awful task.
So these were the Jewish people?
Well, Jewish policemen, and the searches varied. Sometimes they were done by the Germans. Yes. Sometimes the sort of lesser important things.
And they would just come into your home, your different areas at this point, and just start.
Yes, you mean the Germans?
Yeah.
Yes. In fact, I still have that memory of when we knew, sometimes, not always, but those people whose windows looked out onto the street in front, they could see that there was a whole lot of lorries coming along, a whole lot of German soldiers, and we call them gendarmes. And the ghetto was surrounded, and we knew that they're up to something, but that there'll be some sort of deportation. Because the one I was referring to before, that was the main one to liquidate the ghetto. But there were in-between ones as well. And I still remember, so in the flat, and I could hear those German boots coming up. It was probably a wooden staircase. I can't remember, wooden or whatever it was. But you could hear those steps outside coming up and into the flat. And you knew that there's something will happen.
And this is this constant feeling of, as you say, this fear. It's never ending, right? You can never switch off. You constantly got your guard up of who is coming in. And as you say, they constantly start rounding people up now. And you mentioned before your family were together, but not for long. What happened?
Well, they knew that people were coming in, but as I said, they turned a blind eye. So when they thought everybody was back, they started searching for them. Now, I was with my mother and sister, and the three of us were illegal. My father by then got a job, so they had a work permit, my father and my brother. And we were very vulnerable. And when they started searching for us, they stormed into a room where we were with a lot of other people. It was a very crowded room, and we were all illegal. And they took away everybody except me. I was with my mother and sister, and I was in bed. There was nothing wrong with me, but it was so crowded. I just went into this bed, and we were all, people were using other people's beds when they're at work or on a shift. It was a bit chaotic. And I was in bed, and my mother said to the officer in charge, she's not well. And he said, well, that's all right, she can stay. Well, that is so unusual, so unlikely. It was just like a miracle. People, came back from work, they said they've taken everybody, but they've left Mala behind. The whole ghetto was talking about it. But they were sort of searching every day and taking people away, and they were taking them to the synagogue, which by then was a really dilapidated building. They had used it as stables, and it was partially bombed during the war. And it was in a terrible state. They were held there without food or water or sanitary provisions. It was like a hellhole. And they were adding more and more people. As they were searching for people, they were adding them. And then on the 20th of December, 1942, they were taken out. They had to march out in groups of 50 at dawn. And they walked to the nearest forest called Rakov. And they were, it was described afterwards that they were walking to that was their own funeral they were walking to. The first group found their communal grave ready waiting for them. And others followed in groups of 50. They had to dig the next grave for the next group. And they were killed in the most horrific way. We know what happened because witnesses came to tell us. But I just can't collect my thoughts for a minute.
It's okay. Yeah.
We knew what happened, and this was actually happening all over Europe. And the biggest one was in Kiev. There was a ravine there, and they killed thousands of people there. In this case, it was 540 people, I think is the accurate figure. But it was happening all over, and it was done by the 101 battalions, and they had another name as well. There were two different groups that were doing it. I just can't think at the moment of the other name because I know it well. And these forests are all over Europe with people who are killed in a most horrific way. We know what happened, but I can never repeat it. There are lots of books, though, where they describe it very, very vividly. So that's how I lost my mother and sister.
So your mother and sister, you mentioned the 20th of December. They were taken into the forest.
Yeah.
And you're now in the ghetto, as you say. You've used the word miracle twice now. That you were in bed.
I saw, I was there on her own. As my mother was walking out with my sister, she said to me, "Stay there, don't go anywhere, and tell father what happened." Well, they came home. My brother was first to come home. So I told him. Then my father followed later from another working place. And that's what happened. Lots and lots of families were bereaved. And
and that was the last time you ever saw your mum and your sister.
Yeah.
And then as the days and weeks and months go on, as you said, that was 20th December 1942. It gets, and I know there's so much to go into here. Every single day feels like a miracle, as you say. But by July 1943, I know an incident happens. You're now 12.
Yeah.
In front of a senior guard that saves your life.
Yes. Well, the idea was to liquidate the ghetto, get everybody into the barracks that they have in the meantime built around these two very big concerns. And there were still some women and children left and some elderly men. And they searched the ghetto. We called it the small ghetto. It was the big ghetto originally, and then it became very small. And they searched and found people hiding, me and my cousin. Now, another cousin, if I must step back, because at some point in the ghetto, after my mother was taken, my mother and sister, there was another aunt, a Holocaust aunt. And she was taken away screaming, "Who will look after my child?" And she was deported. And by then, I was the only female member of the Holocaust family left. And it was down to me. I was 12 and my cousin Anne was 5. And I looked after her. And after that, they were liquidating the ghetto and everybody was going to be deported. They searched, they got us all out. It wasn't a lot of people. There were mainly women and children and a few elderly men. And I remember standing in a column outside. We were towards the end of this column. And I won't describe what a deportation. I haven't been in a proper deportation before, but this was a comparatively small one. But it was still quite horrific. Because they were shooting people, they were killing people, there were children crying, there were mothers. One woman in front of me was hit with a rifle, but
And you're stood there 12 with your 5-year-old
yeah,
cousin.
and I was and she was sort of the baby was crying, the blood was pouring from her head, and it was horrific. And I don't know what made me look sideways, and I saw a German officer. And I don't know what made me look, and I don't know what made me go up to him, but I did. And I said that I've been separated from my father and brother who are inside the ghetto. And they were, because they were not on shift, they were in the ghetto. So he looked at me quite surprised, amused. I don't know what he was thinking, but he called over policeman, a Jewish policeman, and said, take her back inside the ghetto. And that was, of course, amazing. But I had a problem. As we were walking, I said to him, wait a minute, I've got to get my cousin. And he said, you can't, because she hasn't had permission. So I was left with that dilemma. Do I choose my...
Age 12.
Yes. I was really in a terrible state. But the fact is that the Shoah, as we call it in Hebrew, was full of such dilemmas. I mean, this wasn't unusual. People found themselves in terrible situations, having to give up one child but not the other one, and all sorts of other things. And so I kept arguing with him. I said, I can't go back without her. And, well, in the end, he said, oh, quickly, take her and go through the gates. Yeah. And that was a real bit of luck, because I know where these people ended up. Yeah. I don't know what happened to them in between, because the date of their death on a memorial says sort of a few months later after that happened. The date is after, but they ended up in another forest. And, well, the memorial is in our forest, the same where the others, when I go to visit, I see the two memorials. And the other one, I think it came later. I can't remember now. I haven't been back that many times, but there are two memorials there. One is for those women and children, and the few men, and there was 36 children. And I've actually found a little booklet on what happened to them and how they were killed. And it must be among my things. I haven't been able to find it lately, but I've got it. So everything's been documented.
And then this is July of 1943. Again, you've since found out the fate of those people. Yeah. And as time goes on, because I know so much I want to talk to you about, Mala, and also reflections on your life, because by November 1944...
Yes, but what I didn't tell you was that in between, when the ghetto was liquidated, there were just these two camps. One was a glass works, and one was a plywood producing factory. It was enormous, because plywood, it requires a lot of space for the wood and everything. And then there's the factory producing it. But I was allocated, when the ghetto was liquidated, I was allocated to the plywood factory.
To work?
Yeah. I became a slave laborer at the age of 12. And my little cousin of 5, well, of course, she didn't work, but she was with me. And we lived in barracks, in the women's barracks, and the men's barracks were at the other end of this enormous compound. Gosh. So my father, and brother were there, and I was with Anne. And I used to work. I did a full 12-hour shift. And Anne, who she was so attached to me. She was scared to leave me. If I went to the toilet, she would come with me and wait outside. But she knew she couldn't go to work with me. So, and we worked shifts. So there were always some people there who keep an eye on her.
Okay. Wow. And so this is what's happening, as you say, from 1943 into 1944. You're there looking after Anne.
Yes, yes.
And so what happened in the November of 1944 that I know now meant that you left the ghetto in your hometown?
We were in this sort of camp attached to the workplace, and we're a little way away, but in that area. And we were there about 18 months, and without going into detail, because we were all working.
Yeah.
And we were somehow surviving. And then in 1944,
yes,
in November, they got us into men separately from women. They marched us to the railway station where the cattle trucks were waiting for us. And we didn't know where we were going, but I can tell you now that the men were deported to Buchenwald. So that was my father and brother. And I, with the women, ended up in Ravensbrück concentration camp after a 4.5-day journey.
4.5 days.
Without food or water. I remember standing, breaking it at some point. So I have a very vague memory of that journey, except that it was very, very crowded, and we had no place to sit really. We were standing most of the time. It was very crowded cattle trucks.
And Anne is still with you?
Yes, yeah.
So you're in the cattle truck, as you say, 4.5 days, no water, no food.
I think they may have given us some water but I don't remember it, but I assume that they have, because I don't know how we could have managed without water for 4.5 days. And I remember stops on the journey, so possibly I don't remember every detail.
And I think for people listening to this, I think it's important to know that, you say now 4.5 days, but at the time you don't know where you are, where you're going. An hour, 2 hours, 10 hours a day, is it 2 days? Time is just gone.
Yeah.
Until 4.5 days later, the cattle truck stops. And then what happens? You step off with Anne, and where are you?
Well, we stepped off. I can't remember the exact leaving the train.
Yeah.
I remember it in other instances, in the next camp, for instance, but this one. But I remember arriving in a very large hall with Anne and all the other people. And first of all, we had to give up everything we brought. It wasn't very much, but everybody brought their little bundle of something, probably some food, but if we had that, we ate it.
Yeah.
And then we had to give everything up, and we had to queue up and give our details, because, the Germans were meticulous at record keeping. And in fact, that list exists. It's on, and with my name on it. My and Anne's name on it. It's online. Anyone can get it. And in fact, on that list, I was then 14. I just turned 14 and a little bit. And I remember, I sometimes show it on my PowerPoint at schools. And one of the teachers said to me, "Oh, so you were 16 when you arrived in Ravensbrück?" I said, "No, I was 14. He said, "It says 16 up on the list."
Yeah.
And you see, that was another ploy that children like me, and boys particularly, of say 14, 16, or younger, 12, they'd say, when they ask you your age, say you are 16, because anybody under 16 they wouldn't use for work, and that was a kind of lifesaver to do for children. And everybody did it differently. Probably everybody would tell you a slightly different story of how they did it, why they did it, or who told them to do it. But I was down there at 16.
And what about Anne?
And, well, Anne stood no chance because she was only 7.
Yeah.
But because I did something for me, I felt duty-bound to do something for her. And I gave hers as 10. I mean, she didn't even look 5.
Wow.
She was so small and frail. But I put, and as far as I remember, I can always check it as 10, but mine was definitely 16. And that was the reason. And I hadn't even noticed, I hadn't examined it. It was a teacher who drew my attention to it.
And so you were in the first camp here for, as I understand, 2.5 months, about 10 weeks. Is that right?
Yes, between 2.5 and 3 months.
And so in the first camp, what was daily life like for you and Anne?
Well, strangely enough, we didn't do anything because they considered us children, even though they may have said 16 on what details are. But I just want to tell you the sort of shock of arriving at a concentration camp. And Ravensbrück is the largest concentration camp in Germany, a women's concentration camp in Germany. I've learned that recently from reading it somewhere. And when we arrived, we had to give our details. I told you that.
Yeah.
But after that, we had to undress. Our clothing was taken away. Our heads were shaved. We went through cold communal showers. And when we came out at the other end, we were given the concentration camp garb, the striped jacket and skirt and some shoes. I can't remember. Presume they were wooden. I can't remember the shoes. And when we looked at one another, we couldn't recognize each other. And that was the biggest shock to our system, just looking at your friends. It was, I don't quite know how to describe it, except perhaps just a shock to the system, because we all looked the same. And suddenly you've lost not only all your possessions and you were in a camp, but you lost your personality, your looks, you didn't feel human anymore because you looked exactly the same. You could have come out of some machine. Just a lot of women with stripes and shaved heads. And the effect it had was to make us lose hope, the main effect.
Yeah.
And this and people started to die. This showed itself very quickly because my aunt, Franja Klein, died within a short time of being there. Then my best friend, Pema Blachman, died after that. So I don't know the time scale.
Yeah.
And people were just giving up. And if you notice that I named these people, because to me they were my aunt and my best friend, but because we always talk about 6 million, and this whole thing has gone into a mass of 6 million, I think it's so important that if you know a name, if people know a name, they should always use it. And this was, I have just become aware of it and I started doing it. And I always make a point of saying why I do it, possibly encouraging other people to do it as well if they know the name.
Absolutely. And Mala, there's still so much I want to ask you, but you were in this camp, as you say, the largest women's concentration camp in Germany. And then I go on for 2.5 months then, because you were then transferred, and I think for people listening to know that this next transfer is hundreds of kilometers to the next camp. Why were you transferred from this camp?
Well, I don't know is the answer.
Yeah.
Because everybody, they were always transferring people from one camp to another. And I don't know what purpose it served for them. I can't imagine. There's probably someone somewhere who knows the answer, but I really don't know why. They were, because it involved them in much more transport, in much more work.
Yes.
Why were they doing it? I don't know.
But at this point, it happens, and you then transferred to Bergen Belsen.
Yeah.
And you mentioned before, again, don't remember coming off the cattle truck firstly, but you remember arriving in Bergen Belsen. And is Anne still with you?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, she was there. But during that time, I can't remember which camp, on one occasion, she suddenly closed her eye and fell back. And I thought she had died. I had such a shock. But after a little while she came to. She just fainted, obviously.
Gosh.
But after that, I kept a little bit. We had very little to eat, a slice of bread. But I kept a little bit of it. I had a little, sort of like a handkerchief tied up with my possessions, and one of them was a little bit of bread in case Anne faints again. And I don't know what good it would do, but I remember that I had this brilliant idea that this little bit of bread could save her. Yeah. So from then on, but you know what happened to that little bit of bread? Okay. When we arrived in Bergen Belsen, I don't often tell the story, and there's never time to tell everything anyway. But when we arrived at Bergen Belsen, after a shorter journey, there was no room for us. It was very overcrowded. They were just sending people, irrespective of whether room or not. Terribly crowded. And they put us up in a tent overnight. And that tent had enormous tent. It had, I don't know how many people, were quite closely packed. And people from all over Europe. And I became very aware of it then, because they were all speaking different languages.
Okay.
Because as long as we're in Poland, I only heard Polish or Yiddish, if people spoke that. Yes. So we were there overnight, and there was hardly room to sit down, but I found a little room. I sat down, I held my little bag, and somehow I fell asleep. May have been only for a few minutes. I don't know how long I slept, because it's actually... it wasn't very conducive to going to sleep there.
Of course.
But I fell asleep, and when I woke up, my little bag was gone. Someone had taken it. And it was the most terrible shock. I was so upset. My little tiny bit of bread, which I was keeping for Anne, I was so upset. And I thought, how could anybody do that? Mm-hmm. But we were living under not normal conditions. Exactly. And, there were all sorts of things happening that I have read about other people.
And so you're in Bergen Belsen with Anne. And I think it's just really important to know, especially if people don't know the horrors of the Holocaust and the daily life, because we're going through here talking about months and years, but every single day must feel like an eternity. As you say, it wasn't like you go to sleep and just wake up. There's constant fear in your body. But what was Bergen Belsen like, if you had to describe it in your experience?
Well, I'll do the shortest descriptions that I can. And I know that in England, the older people are aware. They've seen films, and at the time they saw the films coming back from the camp. So when we arrived, after the tent, they actually took us into the camp. And the first thing that hit you was the smell and the smog. And there were people there, but they were kind of shuffling along aimlessly. They were like skeletons. They were skeletons, and they were just shuffling along, and then some of them would just collapse and die as they were shuffling. And there were dead bodies everywhere, and there were piles of bodies. They just couldn't cope with shifting bodies. And in any case, people were so emaciated that they wouldn't have had strength to do it. But that reminds me of another thing about bodies, when ultimately I'll just tell you, there were bodies, there were heaps of bodies and rotting bodies, and it was shocking. And but we got through all that, and they were taking us to some barracks. They were all overcrowded. I don't know whether we would have ended up, but on the way I heard that there's a children's home somewhere in the camp.
Okay.
And I quickly diverted. I went to find it with Anne. We found it. We were interviewed by two women, Dr. Bimko and Sister Luba.
Okay.
And they asked us a lot of questions. And then one of them turned to me and said, well, we are also very overcrowded. But in any case, you, pointing at me, you are too old. And I said, okay. I was by then 14. I said, will you take my cousin? And they said, oh, yes, we were going to take her anyway, but she was only 7.
Yeah.
She was exactly half my age. And Anne would not stay without me. In fact, she was so attached to me, and she was so scared of losing me.
Yeah.
I mean, having lost her mother, she wasn't going to give me up lightly. So she said, no, she's not staying. No one could persuade her. I tried to persuade her because I wanted her to stay. But she wouldn't, and in the end, they decided that they'll take us both in. So that was a real bit of luck. I know that we wouldn't have survived on the main camp. And Frank was there at the time, and not with us, but in the main camp, because I was then ultimately in the children's home with my cousin. And we know what happened to Anne Frank.
And I suppose, speaking of Anne Frank, I know Anne Frank then contracted typhus. And you're in the camp, and I understand you also contract typhus.
I got typhus, even in that slightly better place.
And again, for people listening, I think it's important that people do their own research and look into this a lot more, because there's so much that we're not going to cover in a short podcast, which is your life.
Yeah.
But as the days, weeks, months go on, we get towards 1945, of course. And again, we're never going to do justice to go into the horrors of what you've witnessed and what people have gone through. But the 15th of April in 1945, just talk to me about that day in your memory.
Well, I unfortunately, I succumbed to typhus, even under those so-called better conditions. And I remember lying on my upper bunk by the window. And I must have come back into consciousness, because typhus is a horrible disease. And one loses one's consciousness for most of the time. And I remember opening my eyes, and I saw people running. And I couldn't, what puzzled me, I have one particular small boy that never out of my mind, that I remember, when I think about Belsen. And there were small people, large people, that people were running. And all I could think of was, I didn't wonder why or where they were running, but I thought, how have they got the strength to run? Because typhus is such a debilitating condition that you can hardly move a muscle. And that was the 15th of April when we were liberated by the British. The wonderful, great British people, soldiers.
And so I know then when the British Army liberated, I found a quote from a British soldier who spoke about what he saw when they arrived then. He mentioned here that, in the army, they'd been trained for the war wounded and terrible wounds. But when they arrived in Bergen Belsen, they'd not been trained for this. And corpses lying everywhere, trying to find the live bodies, dead bodies. And I know since then, Mala, you've since met a member of the British Army who liberated the camp. I watched the video, and how was that moment when you met that soldier?
Well, I haven't got any words to describe it because they were just so wonderful, every one of them. And they risked their lives to save ours because some of them did die. They caught typhus and died. Definitely some, a very small number, but they did. But it's a very contagious disease anyways. And they were working with typhus all, for quite a while till they cleared it.
And as the years go on, and again, I know there's so much again that happened in the years that followed, and you found yourself in Sweden.
Yes.
And at this point, before 1947, so were you with Anne when you went to Sweden? Where's Anne in this story?
I was with her, but it's very strange that Anne was very attached to me, and she was terrified of losing me. She went everywhere. I don't know if I mentioned before, if I went to the toilet, she came with me and stood outside, waited. She was really terrified of losing me, and she was terrified of that whole situation we're in. But strangely enough, after the war, she just changed overnight. That fear left her.
Wow.
Because when we were in Sweden, they couldn't they divided us into age groups. And they couldn't put a 7-year-old with a 14-year-old. For the purpose, we were doing a bit of learning. Well, right at the beginning we weren't, but afterwards we were. And so they had to separate us. And she was quite fine with it.
Wow.
I mean, yes, she was. I think that during the war, she was just scared because she saw the situation around her. And she saw the danger of losing me, having lost her mother. Yeah. And she had witnessed so many things, but strangely enough, I've often asked her, not very too often, but I've asked her if, what she remembers and what she felt. And she remembers so little.
Wow.
And she's really, she was only half my age, and I don't remember everything. Yeah. There's an awful lot I don't remember. What I told you is a fraction, because we're talking about 5.5 years.
And so the years go on in 1947 because you assume, because you know what happened to Mum and your sister, and that there's no family. It's you and Anne. But then that changes in 1947.
Yes. I mean, I really think I really thought nobody has survived. And there were people coming round, groups of sort of rabbis and big, sort of from Jewish communities particularly, sort of people with high position within the community. Everybody was searching, making lists, trying to reunite people. Well, one day I got a letter from Ben, but it was quite a long time later. It was nearly a year later. I can't really remember the date, and I did a terrible thing. One day I destroyed my little box of letters. I don't know what possessed me. I just put it on the bonfire. Ben had one or two, but of course they were from me to him.
Yes.
But his to me, everything's gone.
And these, just for people listening, Ben was your brother.
Yeah, Ben.
Of course.
Well, Ben was my brother, and he found me. Ben was very enterprising. He returned to Poland to see if anybody survived. Straight after the war, he was liberated in Czechoslovakia. I can't think of the name of the camp for a minute. Sure. And Czechoslovakia is next door, but still it was a horrific journey because he was nearly killed on the way. And he returned twice because he returned to our hometown. He didn't find any clothes. He didn't find me or my father. That was the only possibility in our family. But he found some relatives of my cousins, an aunt on the other side of my cousin. Yeah. And she said to him, and he told her that my cousin Genek survived, and, he's in Czechoslovakia. I think he was in hospital. He was quite ill. And she said, what? He survived? So where is he? Why didn't you bring him back? And he didn't know what to do. She was quite sort of upset about it. She said, how dare you leave him behind? He had only gone to sea, and he was going back because he heard that there was a transport going to England. And so he went back, collected this cousin, Genek, and took her back to the aunt. His mother died in Ravensbrück. That was my aunt in Ravensbrück. And he left him there, rushed back to Czechoslovakia because he knew there was a transport going to England and he wanted to be on it, and he was. So, but when he was with our cousin going back, they had the most terrible incident. They had a little case, really a small case, with a few things, a few possessions that they must have acquired after the war. Sure. It wasn't anything of great consequence or value. And the two men approached them on the station, waiting for the train, and they showed some identification or something that didn't mean anything. And he said, with the police, will you come back with us to the police station? And they couldn't refuse. These are two policemen. They weren't in uniform, but they said they were policemen in plain clothes. And they followed them back. And they were walking and walking. And they were walking out of town. They could see they're not going to a police station. And they took them to some old hut with people living in it. And for that little case there's hardly anything of value there. And they were going to kill them. And my brother Ben pleaded with them, and somehow they let them go. Wow. But they said to them, to their face, that, you're very lucky because we hadn't let anybody else go in the past. So they killed plenty of people after the war. Wow. Well, there's just certain, I won't say the whole nation they did, but there were such people around who did it. And that was a terrible experience for them.
And now as the years went on, Mala, you reconnected with your brother Ben, and of course eventually you join him in England.
Yes.
And we could spend days together, in this conversation. I feel like we could, because Mala, how do you rebuild a life after everything that you've seen, everything you've been through with Anne, your experiences of the ghetto, Bergen Belsen, you then come to England, and whilst people listening might think, wow, the end of the war, these memories, these visions are still in your mind today. How have you done this?
Well, I've done it. I think that it is the human nature that somehow adjusts. And those that don't just fail. They don't manage to survive. I mean, that was the case in the camp as well. Yeah. But when I arrived in England, but I had already spent 2 years nearly 2 years, not quite, in Sweden. Mm-hmm. And I have experienced wonderful, treatment, and people were very nice, and we had plenty to eat, a little bit too much. I put on a lot of weight. I was sort of getting used to normality a little bit, thinking nobody survived. But then, of course, Ben came to light. And when I arrived in England, there was a wonderful organization called Central British Fund.
Okay.
They still exist, but under a different name, and they're called World Jewish Relief. But the Jewish bit is a bit misleading because they help everybody, not just Jews. But they are Jews who are doing the help. But the help is there for anybody who needs it, and they've done some amazing work. There's a wonderful organization.
Yeah.
So so the Central British Fund were absolutely wonderful to me. We call them the boys. When they came over, the whole big transport, they had a lot of people to deal with. I don't know exactly how it was for them, and I'm sure it was okay. But I can only tell you that when I arrived, because I was just an individual, they were marvelous. Wow. I could go to them to ask for advice. They helped me in anything I needed to resolve anything. But just to step back a tiny bit, I was waiting for a visa to come to England.
Got it. Yeah.
And of course, visas, people come without visas, and everybody says, well, yes, why should they have visas? I don't know what people say. Yeah. I won't make a comment on that. But I waited for a visa. I had to, because those were the rules.
Okay.
And luckily, somebody had a brilliant idea. When that transport of children came over from Czechoslovakia, that the government agreed to take, was going to be 1,000, but only 732 came. They couldn't find 1,000 children. And when they came, so they only used those visas. And somebody said, while I was waiting, they said, why can't we have one of those visas for Mala? They said to the Home Office. And they said, yes, you can have one. No reason why not. So I came. It was still, nearly 2 years before we reunited. But I came much sooner than I would have if somebody didn't have this brilliant idea.
And I think you keep saying that these moments of miracles or luck or fortune. Yeah. And I think, as you can imagine, people listening behind that, there's sadness in the fact that they couldn't find 1,000 children because of what had happened.
Yeah.
And I mean, as you say, you've gone on to rebuild life here in the UK and in England. And of course, Mala, you are such an inspiration, and that word, it doesn't do justice to your life and how much we can all learn from you. And I think you mentioned organizations who've helped you, and I know the Holocaust Educational Trust have been brilliant in their work and raising awareness. But having you on today's show is so important, because one special thing about this particular conversation that we do is I try to understand people's lives and understand, we've all got different personalities. Of course, you mentioned at one time that kind of was almost lost during your experience. But I try to look at the one trait that something about a person who's got them through the darkest of times and also help them lift them up in the good times. And in getting to know you, there's just one word in particular that really jumps out for me, and I have to just write it down. And I know throughout your time, there's so many emotions, feelings that you've gone through, but there's one word that jumps out for me, that every video I've seen of you, everything I've read about your experience and even meeting you today just shines through. And it is this, for me, a very powerful word, which is your optimism. For people who are obviously not in the room right now, to sit with somebody who's been through, and I'm a very emotional person, who's been through so much in their life, yet you are so positive in the way that you have an outlook on life, the hope, the miracles, the visa that you got, the way you looked after Anne, the way that you must have spoken to her, becoming a mother at the age of 12. I just want to ask you, Mala, what does it mean for you to be optimistic? What does this word mean in your life?
I don't know that I'm always optimistic. And I know I give that impression, but I don't know. I do get stressed, and I do get upset, and I do get... I have... Maybe it's not an ambition, but I always want to do the right thing. Yeah. If I upset anybody, I feel more upset than they are. And so I don't know what gives me optimism. I'm not that optimistic, I'm a bit lost for words now because I can't describe what exactly I feel. Things don't always go right for me, and I get very upset like everybody else. But I think that perhaps it's this whole experience has left me with a bit of a sort of with a sadness that I don't show.
Of course, yeah. But
also trying to do the right thing. And if I do the wrong thing, I'm more upset with myself than the other person to whom I did it or whatever. So I don't really know. I don't know the answer, honestly.
And I mean, the reason we're here today is because so many people listening to this story, can take so much away from this and your life experience. And whilst we can't change the past, there's so much we can learn from it. And I'm just so grateful for you sharing even just a glimpse into your life, because honestly, Mala, I feel this podcast could be days long, to go into how much we could learn from you. And I guess I want to finish with a question. And that is, in your many years, and you look amazing, and I've told you that before.
Thank you.
But in years to come, Mala, what do you want people to remember Mala Tribich for?
Remember me. I'm always thinking about what I have sort of passed over to the future generations through speaking to them, speaking in schools, and what it means. They would probably they would be more able to tell you what they have got out of it. Because I do, it's quite demanding, but I do it willingly. And I think it is so important for the younger people to learn. And I have to say that from the questions I hear and from the way they act, and there's some people who have written to me to say I've changed their life, and they actually showed me how, because they kept it up for a little while and they told me what they were doing as a result of listening to me. And in fact, but it hasn't gone beyond about 6 months or a year.
Yeah.
And I'd love to know what's happening now. And when I come across this, I look for it.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and establish contact, see, what the outcome was ultimately. But I have learned a lot from young people as well, because if I may quote one, there in one of the schools was the upper form. Was it the last 2 years of school?
The sixth form, when they're 16, 17, 18. Yeah.
Now, he lives in a village, I don't know if he does now, this was a few years ago, a village in Essex. Yeah. And it's a very famous village. I can't think of the name of it now. Certain things take place there at certain times of the year. And I should carry that letter around with me because I won't do him justice. I won't be able to, won't remember everything, all the lovely words he said. But he thanked me, of course, and then he said he's discussed what I talked about with his school friends, and they feel the same way, and that. He said so many wise words, but I'll tell you the wisest of all was, he said, we must all learn and we must do something about it, about the Shoah, as he called it, or I don't know, the Holocaust. Because if we don't, they will have got away with it. I thought those were the wisest words I could hear. I mean, lots of people have said lots. There are others I know.
Sure.
But the fact, it's true. If we just let it go on and don't keep that memory going and think about it and do something so that it never happens again, then they will have got away with it.
And I think that's a message to people listening. I think two things. One, we all have an opportunity and a responsibility to talk about, the atrocities, but also the learnings from the Holocaust, Shoah, as you mentioned. And the second thing I would say is you mentioned, what you want to be remembered for. And it's really, you've impacted so many people's lives. And I'd love people, if they are listening, just to even write to us of what have they learned from this conversation, no matter how small or how big it is, because I would love to then later share it with Mala and we can go through them in months and years to come together. And Mala, the final thing I just want to say is I've learned so much from you in just an hour, and we haven't even begun to go into the depths of your life and the learnings. And all I know is that I'm so grateful, really, truly honored in my life. I mentioned just earlier to my other half as well, this is one of the most special moments in my life, to sit down and hear your story. And so I will be by your side as long as I can to support in spreading the message, to keep the learnings of the Holocaust alive, because we have to. And I wish you all the best, and I look forward to our relationship going forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And if I may just say a word, also just my last word, is that I really do so appreciate what you're doing. And that is so important. And you've obviously realized the importance and taken it on board, and you are acting on it, which is, well, you couldn't do more than that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mala. Appreciate it. Also, a thank you to you, our listeners, for being part of this community. By watching, subscribing, liking, and also leaving comments on all the videos, it honestly really helps us to grow the show and to invite more incredible guests to join us in the future. Now, our plans are super exciting, and with your support, we can make this even bigger. And so if you do enjoy the show, please do hit the follow button on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you're listening to the podcast. It really means so much to me and all of us at the Superpower podcast. And if you're watching us on board your in-flight entertainment, remember to follow us when you land, or maybe you've got Wi-Fi in the sky. For now, it's a huge thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode of the Superpower podcast with me, Gian Power.